You suddenly wake up, a noise is blowing in your ears, your head feels like it's going to explode. You reach for your alarm clock by your bed, but once you get up to switch it off, the noise stops. The silence of the night returns. You decide to get back into bed, but the agonizing noise hits you again, loud, deafening in your ears. The noise divides the room like an invisible barrier, only making a sound when you cross it. Covering your ears makes no difference to how loud it appears. This is a real account from an American diplomat stationed in Cuba in 2017. Others reported a quiet hum in parts of their houses. The attacks could last minutes or hours, usually at night. They worked at the US Embassy in Havana, but slept in local hotels or rented homes nearby. Finding themselves confused, they found it hard to explain to the doctors. They came down with complex symptoms: tinnitus, which is permanent ringing of the ears, hearing loss, dizziness, difficulty walking, visual disturbances, and problems concentrating. A few of these would go away after a short time, but some will become chronic. Many of them now have permanent hearing loss and have to wear hearing aids, recurring headaches or migraines, vestibular disorder, which is loss of sense of balance, insomnia, difficulty sleeping, and memory problems. 22 US personnel and their families were evacuated from Cuba. News soon travelled to the Canadian diplomats also living in Havana. They also reported similar symptoms and were soon quickly moved back to Canada. Most of the Canadians, though, didn't report any initial noise, only the slow build-up of chronic symptoms. This shows that both can happen. Maybe the Americans hearing it was just an accident when they were exposed. Unlike the Americans, we achieved the full data from the Canadians publicly available. Recent exposure of people tested as soon as they get back from Havana. Remote exposure of people tested more than a month after leaving Havana. The comment attached to the table: overall symptoms improved, but cognition still bad. Looks at photos but does not recognize people in them. Trouble driving, can't tell distances. Episodes of tingling, top of head, and down right side of face for 20 minutes. The patients were shown to have decreases in fibre density and white matter in the brain, more effect taking place over a greater period of time. The patients were also shown to have a leaky blood-brain barrier. This is important, I'll come back later. As well as that data, it contains the post-mortem results from a dog. An exposed dog belonging to one of the diplomatic families developed changes in behaviour during their time in Havana, specifically aggression and epileptic seizures. Consequently, he was euthanized. The only potential eyewitness who saw anything out of the ordinary was a family member of one of the US employees, who heard the sound, then looked into the street and saw a van speeding away. The important thing to understand is that most of the victims are actually CIA agents who are undercover as diplomats. It is a common practice popularized during the Cold War to get spies into uncooperative countries. So there is a game to figure out who are the undercover agents and to put them under watch so they don't communicate with moles within your own side. When tensions get bad between countries, a common practice is to kick out the diplomats. These diplomats are the ones they most suspect to be spies. The perpetrators were just trying to target members of the CIA, but hit some diplomats in the process. Also, they may have accidentally hit the Canadians. The mysterious illness was named Havana Syndrome. Then more cases started piling in. Mark was an undercover CIA operative. After serving for years in the Middle East hunting down terrorists in Pakistan and Yemen, he was reassigned and entered the higher ranks of the CIA. He became the Deputy Chief of Operations for Europe and Eurasian Mission Center. He refocused the efforts of the 50 centers around Europe to target the Russian operations across the continent. In the fall of 2017, he and a colleague decided they wanted first-hand knowledge of their counterparts in Moscow. Planning to meet with the US ambassador, embassy staff, and maybe a conversation with their counterparts in Russian intelligence. It struck him in a Moscow hotel room. He woke up with an overwhelming sense of nausea, got up to go to the bathroom and collapsed as he got out of bed. Tried again to stand up, but once again fell over. His ears were ringing and he felt, quote, like I was going to throw up and pass out at the same time. In the morning, most of the symptoms had passed, so he continued in his work. Everything went fine for the rest of the trip until 2 days before he was going to leave, he was struck again with the same feeling of nausea at a high-class Russian restaurant. He struggled back to his hotel room and couldn't move from his bed for the rest of the trip. Once getting back to America, he could operate fine. But after a few weeks, he began experiencing an intense and painful pressure that started in the back of his head and radiated forward to his face. Vertigo and nausea returned next, and then the ringing in his ears. By March 2018, he had lost his long-distance vision and could no longer drive. He took an early retirement due to the debilitating migraines that were stopping him from working. The next place to be hit was US Embassy staff in Guangzhou, China. It was late 2017, early 2018. 16 Americans were evacuated from China after failing medical tests.
Last year, Catherine Werner, a U.S. diplomat stationed in China, told her parents she was experiencing strange sounds and sensations in her apartment. Her health was declining rapidly.
Just struggling, and she's just a shell of what she was.
Her mother, Laura Hughes, an Air Force veteran, was so alarmed she quickly booked a flight to China.
You notice when something's wrong with your children, and there was something very wrong with Catherine.
Laura tried replacing the apartment's air filters and buying imported food. Nothing helped. And then Laura says she started feeling it too.
We heard a very high-pitched sound in Catherine's bedroom, and we heard a very low pulsing sound in the living room. Our heads would pulse. You would feel like you would want to regurgitate. You could become instantly paralyzed, instantaneously fatigued.
Laura has also developed visual problems, including sensitivity to light, which is why she's wearing dark glasses today. As mother and daughter struggled, Laura says their dogs also began acting strangely.
They'd be shivering under the bed when we returned to the apartment. They would vomit blood. They didn't want to go back into the apartment after long walks. And they would run down the hallway and stop just where the living room begins and just sit there, and their heads would move simultaneously. We were so scared, we didn't know what could they possibly be looking at.
After 3 months, Laura, unable to tolerate it any longer, headed back to the U.S. 3 weeks later, the State Department medevaced Catherine out of China.
The doctors diagnosed Catherine with traumatic brain injury. Their findings were the same as they found for the U.S. diplomats from Cuba.
Taking into account the symptoms affecting the dogs might have been caused by something else. If the foreign agents had gained access to the apartment, they could have easily fed the dogs poisoned meat. That story out of China is the only one where a witness has gone to the press, but there was an even worse event that has been reported on. An American diplomat and his spouse, who had been hit when they were stationed in China, travelled to Philadelphia to get specialised treatment at the University of Pennsylvania. One night in June 2018, according to free government sources, the couple was startled awake by a sound and pressure in their heads similar to what they had felt back in China. On the advice of FBI agents, the family moved to a hotel, but on their second night there, they were again awoken in the early morning hours. Terrified, the parents ran into the room where their children were sleeping, to find them moving in their sleep, bizarrely and in unison. In the weeks afterwards, the children developed vision and balance difficulties. Washington, D.C., late November 2019. A White House staffer was hit while walking a dog in Arlington, Virginia, a suburb of Washington, D.C. According to a government source familiar with the incident, the staffer passed a parked van. A man got out and walked past her. Her dog started seizing up. Then she felt it too, a high-pitched ringing in her ears, an intense headache, and a tingling on the side of her face. Then, a year later in November 2020, right near the White House, another staffer reported the symptoms. So, what is causing Havana Syndrome? This is completely different from any weapons we have seen throughout history. Nothing physical has to touch you, it can even go through walls and windows. It sometimes causes a noise to be heard, but this noise acts differently from usual sound. If you cover your ears, it doesn't get any quieter. It can't be heard unless you're in a specific area. Neighbours didn't hear anything, and it's loud in some parts of the room, but can't be heard at all in some other places. Certainly bizarre. To explain the noise, we have to go back 60 years to the Cold War. In 1960, Allen Frey was 25 years old and worked at the General Electric's Advanced Electronics Center at Cornell University. One day, a radar technician came in claiming he could hear radar waves. Frey followed the technician back to his workplace and heard the radar signals himself. Frey decided that the effect described by the technician was in his opinion factual. The radiation could cause audible buzzes or clicks. Microwave radiation could be heard by humans, but not in the same way the sound waves are perceived. From Frey's paper. With appropriate modulation, the perception of various sounds can be induced in clinically deaf as well as normal human subjects at a distance of inches up to thousands of feet from the transmitter. With somewhat different transmitter parameters, we can induce the perception of severe buffeting of the head, with such apparent vestibular symptoms as dizziness or nausea. Changing transmitter parameters again, one can induce a pins and needles sensation. Some of the workers claim that microwave hearing was accompanied by side effects such as dizziness and headaches, and that signals of radiation could be heard by them, even at a distance of 100 meters from the radar. The kind of microwaves he was using was pulsed microwaves. This kind won't be produced by normal devices without significant hacking and a large amount of power. The wave would be peaked every split second and then produce the sound and the target. Frey published many papers on the effect and became the top of the field in the US, over the 60s and 70s, primarily focusing on the health effects from radiation, getting funding from the US Navy research and the US military, testing pulsed microwaves on rats, frogs, guinea pigs, cats and monkeys. Getting cats and monkeys to avoid irradiated areas, he managed to get frog hearts to stop by firing pulsed microwaves at them. Later on he admitted he stopped using human subjects because of the headaches. In 1975 he did a controversial experiment on the blood-brain barrier. He showed that mice injected with dye in the blood when exposed to microwaves, the dyes crossed from the blood into the brain, with the effect being worse when the microwaves were pulsed. At the same time, the USSR and other communist bloc countries were further ahead in microwave research. Frey and the other scientists would actually travel to the Soviet Union to lecture and to learn how Soviet experiments were carried out. This classified report was put together by US intelligence in 1976 into the experiments carried out by the USSR and the other Eastern Bloc countries. They tested microwave radiation on a menagerie of animals, but also on human subjects. They stopped mice's hearts with lethal doses of radiation. The Soviet citizens were put without knowing into microwave-irradiated workplaces, and the most common subjective complaints were headache, fatigue, perspiring, dizziness, mental disorders, irritability, agitation, tension, drowsiness, sleeplessness, depression, anxiety, forgetfulness, and lack of concentration. A lot of these symptoms should sound familiar. Quote, their internal sound perception research has great potential for development into a system for disorientating or disrupting the behaviour patterns of military or diplomatic personnel. It could be used equally as well as an interrogation tool. This was a great prediction of what we are seeing today. Another extract. One psychological effect has been demonstrated as heart seizure. This has been accomplished experimentally in frogs by synchronizing a pulsed ultra-high frequency microwave signal of low average power density with the depolarization of the myocardium and beaming the signal at the thoracic area. This is what Allen Frey proved in one of his experiments. A frequency probably could be found which would provide sufficient penetration to the chest wall of humans to have accomplished the same effect. Another possibility is alteration of the permeability of the blood-brain barrier. This could allow neurotoxins in the blood to cross. As a result, an individual could develop severe neuropathological symptoms and either die or become seriously impaired neurologically. Around the same time, other scientists were proving Frey's research on the blood-brain barrier correct, replicating it and demonstrating it in hamsters. After this, Frey claims the US government tried to bury his research. Scientists came out in the late 70s claiming that they couldn't reproduce the blood-brain barrier experiment. Frey believes that they were hired by the US government to discredit his research by deliberately doing his experiments wrong. Shortly after this, his funding wasn't renewed by the US government. This is a very controversial subject. Because of this debate, work into the health effects of microwaves was stalled in the US for decades. In the 90s and early 2000s, Frey was one of the few scientists who spoke out against the rise of mobile phones. As a result, he is one of the key scientists who get cited by the anti-mobile phone and anti-4G groups, so his work is contentious to this day. The blood-brain barrier research was reproduced in the early 2000s, proving that his work was correct. Of course, we can see the Canadian scans showing the leakage of the barrier after Havana Syndrome. He blames the US government's switch on microwave research to the Cold War, wanting to keep the research secret from the Russians and to keep the critical security functioning, such as radar scanners. We see some evidence of this motive in the declassified report. If the more advanced nations of the West are strict in their enforcement of stringent exposure standards, there could be unfavourable effects on industrial output and military functions. The Eurasian communist countries could, on the other hand, give lip service to strict standards but allow their military to operate without restriction, and thereby gain the advantage in electronic warfare techniques and the development of anti-personnel applications. The US government probably wanted to protect the radar systems they use to detect missiles and foreign aircraft entering their airspace. The microwave auditory effect did get researched in the 60s and 70s, but once the US military switched its opinion on it, it looks like the US government stopped working to it. Quote, the state of that science has, for the most part, been, if not abandoned, pretty much left fallow in the United States, but it has not been fallow elsewhere, said James Durando, Professor of Neurology and Ethics at Georgetown University Medical Center. Once the victims of Havana came forward, the US government wouldn't accept their accounts and the explanation. Most of the doctors they went to thought the effects were all psychological. That's why many of the victims went to the press and their stories had been told. After that, the Chinese embassy was hit, and White House staff were targeted outside the White House. They had to accept that a foreign state was targeting US civilians, so they talked to the experts. Allen Frey, in his 80s, was now questioned on the effect, and they also recruited the experts in the field. There was reports that they planned to carry out experiments again, testing on primates in the lab. James Durando is also a senior fellow in biotechnology, biosecurity and ethics at the US Navy War College, and was brought in as advisor by the government after the Havana attacks. He continues, it became clear that some of the work that was conducted in the former Soviet Union was taken up again by Russia in its satellite proxies. This was important and rather frightening to us, because it represented a state of advancement and sophistication of these types of instruments that heretofore had not been thought to be accomplished. James Lynn, the leading authority in the US on microwave health effects, says, you can certainly put together a system in a couple of big suitcases that will allow you to put it in a van or an SUV. It's not something that you need to have enormous amounts of space or equipment to do it. We are looking at a collection of foreign agents travelling around in a van with a microwave beam weapon. This beam could probably go through walls, hitting entire rooms, causing short-term sickness, which after a couple of months develops into brain damage. The range can go to thousands of feet, some reports have it go up to 2 miles away. Cases of Havana Syndrome have only continued to spread recently. Of course, a slowdown over 2020 due to global travel being shut down. The embassy in Vienna, Austria was hit in July 2021. The CIA section chief was recalled because he wasn't taking it seriously enough. Vice President Kamala Harris's trip to Vietnam was delayed due to a diplomat getting symptoms. A CIA officer got hit while in India with the CIA director. The US Embassy in Berlin was reported to be attacked, and the Colombian US Embassy is reported to be attacked. These are just the cases in the last couple of months. The most likely option for who is perpetrating the attacks is the Russians. During the Cold War, they were further ahead than the US than any other country. When the US stopped their research, the Russians must have continued their research. We are looking for a country which doesn't let the US, has the capabilities to target around the world CIA agents, and willing to face heavy sanctions from the US and its allies. The obvious choice is Russia. Once the CIA has hard evidence against them, expect more banishing of diplomats. Also in the short term, I fear that Russian dissidents will be given brain damage to get rid of them. Prayers go out to Alexei Navalny. The Russian agents have already tried to kill him, and now he's trapped in a cell in Russia. Worst case scenario is that the Russians can turn the weapon from the brain onto the heart and cause heart attacks in victims. This would leave no visual trace and do it a football field away. In the medium term, this weapon will probably be deployed on the battlefield. If you know the enemy is in a house ready to shoot out of a window, just deploy the weapon behind cover and point it in the right direction. Then fire bursts of radiation through your cover and through the enemy's cover, making them collapse and throw up for easier capture of their position. The US Department of Defense at the start of 2021 put out a contract to develop a wearable radio frequency weapon exposure detector for deployment with troops, to prepare for radio frequency weapons. You can also just flood the enemy's side with a general low-level amount of radiation. The troops won't notice and the brain damage will slowly build up over time. This is the key reason why the US is trying to develop the wearable detectors. Let's hope this technology isn't easy to make, because once the knowledge gets out, many psychopaths will try and develop the weapon to test it on people they don't like. This weapon is effectively a high-powered microwave oven. In the long term, we need a microwave weapons convention to outlaw or regulate the microwave weapons. Similar to the chemical weapons convention, giving all soldiers on the battlefield brain damage is just inhumane. If you want to check what I'm saying in this video, all references are in the description. If you want to look into Dr. Frey's more controversial theories, just make sure you keep your head on your shoulders. God bless and stay safe out there.